My behaviour and communications on this podcast are not an accurate reflection of how I interact in my other businesses. Basically, I don't ever swear at children. If this podcast causes you distress of any kind, either by what I say or who I am, then do yourself a favour and go away. The very first thing we need to address in this podcast about honesty is why it doesn't always happen. Seriously, what is the challenge with being honest with people? But it seems that it's something that not all of us have mastered. And here's why I believe some people find it very difficult to be honest with others. It all comes down to those terrifying things that we might have to deal with, i.e. other people's feelings. By being honest, sometimes it means we're going to invoke a reaction in somebody else's feelings that then we've got to somehow manage and cope with, that quite frankly we could avoid if we just lie or we don't speak the absolute truth or we keep our feelings covered up. So when I talk about honesty, I'm not just saying avoiding lying, I'm also saying avoiding sharing your honest feelings about something with someone else. Concealing the way that you really think and feel is also a form of dishonesty. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I'm going to. I notice often that this fear of being honest happens more so, generally speaking, for men than for women. Because I think women are, generally speaking, better at managing people's emotions because they're more emotional creatures, or maybe they're not more emotional creatures. I think actually women are probably just as emotional as men, and that men are sometimes perhaps even more emotional. But men have been pre-programmed by society to believe that they shouldn't share their feelings and that they should conceal their emotions. So it means that then men don't get to interact with emotions quite so much, and that when it comes to being honest, particularly with women, they know that there's a strong chance that they're going to get an emotional reaction, and they're not trained in how to deal with that, because they're not even trained in how to deal with their own. So rather than facing up to the things that perhaps they should be facing up to, they stick their head in the sand and avoid it. Now, listen, women are not getting off scot-free here, because women too have a way of, what do? I guess we deflect things. And maybe instead of being honest about how we're feeling, we're more likely to create drama somewhere else in our lives in order to draw attention to the fact that we're hurting in some way. So rather than being honest about what we're thinking and feeling, whereas a man would conceal it all, a woman will deal with it, but just not necessarily head on. She'll cause problems somewhere else, and then that will get the attention and it will help her to perhaps act out the feelings that she's feeling, but she's not being truthful about the situation that's really causing the pain. So I believe that we have a fear of being honest because we're also fearful of how we are going to deal with the feelings and emotions of other people as a result of the honest communication that we might end up having with them. Now, of course, we're tactful creatures. We have the ability to share how we're thinking and feeling, whilst also minimizing the impact that that communication might have. Yet sometimes I think we forget that, or we're too fearful of the outcome to engage with our tactfulness and be able to be honest with the people we need to be honest with. The other important thing to add is that there are times when it's appropriate to be dishonest. Now, that's something that I do not enjoy doing on a personal level, but recently I've had to do an awful lot more of it. Most of you will know that my mum has a brain disease called FTD, or the proper name for it is behavioural variant frontal temporal dementia. It's not like the other kinds of dementias that people know about. This is a very rare form and it affects a different part of the brain, meaning that her memory is largely intact, but other strange behaviors are going on instead. Now, one of the things that has changed in her personality, which is a big part of the sort of disease that she has, is it's actually changing her as a person, is that she is now very selfish, quite demanding, quite rude, and many other unpleasant human traits. Now, she's not doing those things on purpose. It's just that the parts of her brain that used to control empathy, sympathy, connection, rapport building, the ability to see if someone was bawling their eyes out in front of her, those are now gone. So she now functions on a very simplistic level, and her mind is perhaps a little bit like a toddler's mind might be. I find myself in a situation where I frequently lie to her because she makes demands of me that I do not want to fulfill, yet nor do I want to have an argument. So instead, I will make up reasons that do not exist, or excuses, or just outright mistruths to help me avoid having to do the things that she might be demanding that I do, which are completely unreasonable the majority of the time. For example, after she had gotten into rather a lot of debt, she then demanded that we went on a round the world cruise. That's just not possible. But rather than going through the argument, I instead made up an excuse about why it wouldn't be possible, and may have suggested that perhaps we could do it at some stage in the future instead. In this situation, being honest doesn't really have any benefits, and most of the time being honest does. So here's the thing, generally speaking, honesty is the best policy unless the outcomes of being honest are more detrimental than if you were to not be truthful. Let me give you another example, and this is perhaps a little bit of a controversial one. I'd be happy to take your own thoughts and opinions on this particular one in the comment section below. Let's imagine that a woman had an affair 20 years ago, and the affair has long been over. Like, it was over 20 years ago. It was over just as soon as it started. 20 years later, she decides to tell her husband because for the last 20 years she's carried around all that guilt. Is that honesty really going to be helpful? Or is that honesty going to be damaging to her husband and only really serve the purpose of releasing her from the guilt that she was feeling? In that sort of a situation, in my opinion, honesty would do more harm than good, because she's not being honest for the sake of giving the truth. She's being honest for the sake of relieving herself of her own pain, knowing that that pain will then shift from her to her husband when he finds out what happened. So to evaluate whether the right thing to do is to be honest or not, the question to ask yourself is, for what purpose do I want to be honest? If the purpose for being honest is to enlighten someone else, to give them other choices and options in their life, and to make sure that they've got a proper understanding of the situation, then all of those are good reasons to be honest. But if the purpose for being honest is to relieve yourself of your own bad feelings, and that an outcome of that might be that that pain is then shifted to somebody else, then that's not a good reason to be honest. Now, if by exposing someone to that temporary pain, it might mean that then they are later freer to be able to do other better things or to move on in their lives in ways that they might not have been able to otherwise, then perhaps being honest in that situation, albeit one that could induce pain, is ultimately for the right reasons. But if it looks like pain is going to be the only thing to come out of that honesty, then I don't really see the point in being honest. If you need to rid yourself of your own negative emotions like guilt, then being honest is not necessarily the right way to do that. get a therapist and get some therapy instead. But you don't necessarily need to ruin other people's lives with your honesty. There is, however, that balancing act, that fine line between causing someone pain but knowing ultimately it will be the right thing for them, versus not being honest at all and leading them on in a certain way of thinking because you haven't been upfront and honest with them about what you really think and what you really feel. Overall, honesty can free you, and it can free others from that feeling of being stuck or from not knowing what the other options in life might be, the other things that might be available to you that you didn't even know that you could go off and explore. Honesty on the whole is the best policy, but it's always worth thinking about the purpose behind your reasons for being honest, just to be on the safe side. Overall, the main message from this podcast is that being honest and open about your feelings means that as a society, we perhaps then get better at dealing with our feelings and emotions. And that would be a good thing for our long-term mental health, is if we are more open and honest about the fact that we're thinking and feeling certain ways, rather than just holding all of that in and bottling it up and pretending that it doesn't exist, or causing dramas in other areas of our lives to act out the bad feelings that we're feeling, instead of being honest about them with the people that we should be honest about them with. Very often the things that we resist in life are the things that persist the most. So if you notice that you've got certain uncomfortable feelings that you're dealing with, it's probably because you haven't been honest about them or faced up to them just yet. As soon as you do, you'll find them much easier to cope with because it puts them into better proportion. Usually the things that we keep in our minds seem far bigger and scarier than they really are when you set them free and talk about them and hold them up to the light and examine them for what they really are. So I hope today's podcast was useful for you, but I'll leave it to you to give me your honest opinion. If you enjoyed it, then make sure that you go ahead and hit that like button if you are watching on YouTube, that is, and that you are subscribed to the podcast both on iTunes and on YouTube, which you can do on YouTube by hitting the red subscribe button and then clicking the notifications bell so that you get notified the next time I upload a video. Make sure too that you hook up with me on all of the different social media channels that we have for People Building. You can find details of those in the description box below. But for now, thank you very much for watching and listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye!